So now we turn to Bob Perelman's poem Chronic Meanings. And it is a pre-elegy for Lee Hickman, an editor, Los Angeles based, whom Bob didn't know very well, but he felt he needed to talk to Lee about the information that Bob had received that Lee was dying of AIDS. So he writes this as pre-elegy. So how is it written? What's the structure of it? Amaris?
Well, upon first glance, it looks like a series of Silliman-like new sentences, but the fact that it's organized in quatrains of each line with 5 words each, and it's ended by a period, just creates a very sort of severe impression of this life being cut off.
Okay, you went right to the big thing about the way the form works with the content. We'll definitely get back to that. So you've said, in the most basic way, you've said 5 words, no more, no less. What do we call that? Is there a word for that?
Constraint.
A constraint. So he imposed upon himself a constraint. Why, in the face of someone's death, would you insist, it just strikes me, I'm being a little, devil's advocate-ish here, but it might strike one that the way to memorialize someone would be to be full and free and not constrained. Why constraint? Why does constraint work? Dave?
In some sense, being forced to express himself within this constraint is a loss of control. He's unable to have the control over his expressions of those feelings.
How does he lose control?
By not being able to express the full thought, the constraint stops him, leaves him hanging.
So by forcing yourself, and I recommend that you try this, try to speak sentences for a whole day in which you only speak 3-word sentences. It will drive people crazy. How will it drive them crazy?
Probably by waiting for me to construct a 3-word sentence.
That 3 is really a constraint. Molly, what would it do to somebody if we spoke or wrote in this kind of constrained way? What's missing? What's annoying?
Well, you're leaving something out, and you don't know where the sentence was going, so you have to fill in the blanks yourself.
Who doesn't know where the sentence is going?
The reader, the listener.
The reader and listener, but it's also possible that Bob Perelman, in many cases, as he said himself, didn't know where a lot of these sentences were going. Once he got into the rhythm of writing 5-word sentences, some of the sentences, such as economics is not my strong, well, clearly he meant economics is not my strong suit. That's a 6-word sentence. And everybody thinks suit when you hear that. But the clock face and we have no idea where he was going, and he probably doesn't either. Anna, what were you going to say?
Well, it's just, I think that creates such a kind of interesting tension and sort of dynamic that there's some that you almost auto-fill, like midnight, the pain is almost, people, you might, it's almost easy to fill it in with midnight, the pain is almost unbearable.
Almost unbearable.
And there's
Right.
others like...
Can we stop there, though?
Yeah.
Midnight, the pain is almost unbearable. So what does it say about us that we can autofill, as you put it in this iPhone age?
Yeah, sure. I think there's certain kind of words and phrases that just sort of go together. Mm-hmm. And he plays with that a lot.
So what's the word that we autofill there?
In midnight?
Unbearable.
Unbearable.
Is there any irony in that? That we go around autofilling a word like unbearable to describe pain? Yeah. I think that Bob is pointing out, and his colleagues, they're pointing out that every word potentially does work, enacts work, and we should not autofill. The fact that we autofill is itself meaningful.
You could say midnight, the pain is almost less.
Yes, it is true. But I was going along with the autofill idea. There's some other ones here in which.
But I think that's what he's saying. I think he's saying that we shouldn't be autofilling.
Right. So again, let's go, before we look at some lines that will really allow us to do some reading of this. Say that again. That thing that you said at the very end of your brilliant first intro comment.
Well, when I first read it, I was thinking, oh, why isn't it organized like a prose poem? And then it seemed to have sort of more of a Dickinsonian form, but in her poems, she used dashes, which seemed to imply some sort of continuity or a sense of fraying.
And openness.
And openness. And here, I mean, I think that same openness exists, but the punctuation of a period just makes it so much more heart-wrenching. There is really that sense of finality a sense of incompletion, a sense of...
Faux finality of the period, right.
Yeah.
So somebody want to say about the way in which form and content work here?
Well, cutting off a line, cutting off a sentence, and cutting off someone's life seem to say a lot about each other.
Is there a better way to memorialize someone who dies early, young of AIDS, than to do it using an expression that doesn't finish, that is cut off? Okay, so that's I almost want to say trick, but that's wrong, because this is in a way, a sincere version of this avant-gardism. So we have to do the work of filling in, and we feel terribly guilty when we autofill. And we are, at our best, are participating in making the meaning and really trying to understand what that cut-off life means. So let's look at some lines. Okay. So, what do we have? What's a favorite line of yours, Kristen?
I like, this is the fourth stanza up from the end of the poem. You think people would have, or that they would invent. And especially in the way that Bob reads this, it seems to me that he's, talking to Lee, like, you would think that people would have come up with a way to fight this disease, or that they would invent some
or that
medicine.
This would be a priority.
Yeah. And I think that's very evocative.
And that we don't know what is to be invented is exactly the point. All right, who's got another one, a line that's worth mentioning? Max?
I like in the middle, a few stanzas above from where Kristen just pointed us to, the impossibility of the simplest. So shut the fucking thing. Now I've gone and put that makes the world. This is this moment of frustration, the impossibility of the simplest. It could be anything, but we all know how frustrating it is when we're confronted with the impossibility of the simplest blank, whether it's the simplest thing to say, or the simplest little task, or the simplest anything. It's just frustrating, and we just want to shut the fucking thing, whatever it is. It's just like that's all you have to do. So just do it. And yet you can't. It's frustrating. And now I've gone and put. It could be a number of things. Now I've gone and put you off, or now I've gone and put a. I don't know. It seems almost apologetic there. It's like, well, now I've gone and done this, and I lost my cool. And yet it's also caught in there, in that little chunk. It's so good.
With respect to that line, so shut the fucking thing, Bob Perelman says something about meter and the way in which this kind of writing is different from the metrical writing that would complete the line because of meter. Does anybody want to say anything about that, or the transition that's being made here? What's he saying there? He's talking about iambic pentameter there, and he's saying, I vote against it. I'm not, yes, I read the Romantics, yes, I'm interested in he's referring to the, Wordsworthian ballad, and getting all the stresses done, right? So that the complete line there would necessarily do the whole metrical thing to the end. And that is an arbitrary way of doing it too. But rather than do that, he wants to take 5 words, not 5 stresses, but 5 words, and cut that off. It's a new kind of meter.
Didn't you say you should have new sounds and new meters for old new ears? That it doesn't work to have iambic pentameter to describe, like in that kind of ordered iambic pentameter or any other classical meter you might have. Those types of meters don't work in a world that has this kind of discontinuity and discord existing in it.
And I think also in the iambic pentameter, when you get to the end of the phrase, you have this sense of arrival that, oh, like you were feeling that stress, anticipating it. But here, the poem seems to express that these words don't arrive at their destination because Lee Hickman dies at this point. And to me, a lot of those phrases, even the one that Kristen selected, sort of resonates with that idea of the inability to describe or evoke loss or to say it adequately. So saying like a physical mouth without speech. So shut the fucking thing.
So what Perelman's doing is elaborating further the innovation of Silliman's new sentence. The rough ratio would go like this, I think. The line, the poetic line, is to the new sentence, as the iambic pentameter meter is to this constraint of 5 words and nothing more. Let's count words. Let's not count feet, metrical feet. Right. So that allows us to enable this form content harmonizing or disharmonizing that you're talking about. And it's an alternative to meter. This is what avant-garde poetry does. All right, a couple more lines that you particularly think help us
One that's
understand this.
The one that's always stood out to me in the many times I've read this poem is the coffee sounds intriguing, but because there's so much like regret.
Can you tell us the story?
Maybe Lee said to Bob, or
anyone says to anyone.
Anyone
Right.
says to anyone, let's go grab a coffee. And that sounds great, but I can't. I'm busy. And then maybe tomorrow that person's not there anymore. I get coffee with you. This stuff happens.
And it almost doesn't matter what the flimsy excuse was.
Doesn't matter at all.
So that's the openness here. Dave?
My favorite line is about halfway through. It's the last line of maybe the 13th or 14th stanza. And it's simply, now put down your pencils. And it's not cut off, it's a complete sentence, but to me it just communicates that
What's
loss
the
of
reference?
control.
What's the
It's to
reference?
a standardized test, and
It is absolutely a reference. It is the only, I think there might be some school exams where someone would say that, but it's particularly associated with standardized tests. It is the most, what do we say, socially enforced thing you could be doing with a pencil. Go ahead, Dave.
And I view this as being in the middle of an answer, in the middle of some type of control, and being told, no, stop, you're done. Whatever you are, put your pencil down, you're done.
Yeah.
And of course, Amaris could also read it metapoetically.
Maybe that idea that even these words are not enough. So stop, put down your pencil at the point when you want to complete the meter.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I like
Such an alternative.
5 words can say only, because that really sets up
Another
what
metapoetic line.
what he's about to do in the entire poem, and that's cut off because 5 words can't say it all.
It's interesting to think about only as almost the thing that 5 words can say. Only as a noun, forced into being a noun. The point I am trying, but did that really mean? I remember the look in. It was the first time. That's the one that when I'm teaching this poem, in front of a large group, that gets me all emotional. It was the first time. I mean, I'm not even thinking about Bob. I'm not thinking about Lee Hickman when he says that line. I'm thinking about any of those first times when you're reflecting. Come what may, it can't. Who wants to do something with that? Come what may, it can't.
Well, it's incredibly, because that's trying to express a certainty, and even though a doubtful certainty, come what may, it can't possibly be that bad. By not being able to make that declarative statement that it can't be something, it means it can be whatever you're fearing. It means that there is no certainty of any kind.
So what do we say to a doubter and a detractor who says, this avant-gardism is fun, it's kind of a trick, but this man is dying or died, and don't you think you should say something about his life? Any doubt? How do you respond? It does?
This says a lot about his life. It doesn't say he was born in this year, he was born in this place, he lived here, he did this, his friends were these people. But it says a lot about what happened to him.
And in the way that Frank O'Hara's The Day Lady Died, we talked about how a more effective way of elegizing someone is to talk about the human experience of loss and what that person meant to you. So here, Perelman expresses that sense of feeling cut off the way that O'Hara expressed how much the artistic
He
performance
gets to feel,
meant to
in a
him.
minor way, linguistic way, the pain of having to not finish, of being cut off. He actually has to do it. Yeah, Kristen, what were you going to say?
The other thing I think is, the title of this poem is Chronic Meanings, and I think that a typical elegy or a typical obituary, when you're trying to eulogize someone, tries to make a meaning out of their death and tries to make it make sense.
And this one doesn't.
And this one doesn't. And this one, we participate in the meaninglessness of it because as you're reading this poem, you're trying to figure out what Bob would have said if he had a couple more words in each sentence. But having it be so senseless, I think works perfectly.
Perelman once said of this poem, if one expects a poem to be more or less narrative, focusing sharply or softly on spots of time, then Chronic Meanings might feel evasive. What do you think he means? And what do you think he means by that? And what is the response to the person who would accuse this of being evasive? He's referring to spots of time. That's a very specific reference. Maybe I need to help you with that one. Okay, that's Wordsworth, right? That's the romantic notion that a poem focuses on a particular intensely, or maybe emotional, or visually stimulating moment, and that it does its work in a spot of time. Okay, and if you're expecting a poem to do that, to focus sharply or softly on spots of time, Chronic Meanings will feel evasive. What would be meant by evasive there?
Maybe it can be summed up by his line, memorized experience can't be completely. So that idea that memory is never enough, and a poem that takes one image and sort of, I don't want to say romanticizes it, but sort of dramatizes it and creates into this symbolic moment of a whole life is art and artifice, and kind of does
an imposition
disservice.
of narrative on really something that verges on non-narrative. Okay, so let me just add a kind of a fact that's associated with this poem, and you can react to it as our final words here, okay? So it's not only that Perelman finds out that Hickman is dying of AIDS, but he writes the poem, and Lee Hickman typeset the poem himself for an issue of Tembler before he dies. What do you make of that? How does that tell us something about what's so important to the language poets? It's a really perfect instance of this, but say anything you like about that. What do you get from that? Max?
It's sort of destabilizing the poet's or the author's authority in a way, in that Perelman writes these lines, but then there's this whole sort of physical act that Hickman has to go through of recreating the lines and thus participating in the sort of creation of this language.
Yeah, you've got your emotion suggests that he's hand setting. It's letterpress. I'm not sure it was letterpress. I like that. That's even better. But
I think that there's something beautiful.
He had to type them. He typed these incomplete sentences. About him. I mean, if the language poets are interested in creating these relationships between writers and readers, and in this case, of course, readers must do the work of finishing the thought, or at least of resisting the natural temptation to finish the thought. This poem actually celebrates a relationship between writer and editor and typesetter, or writer, and in this case, reader, or elegist and subject of the elegy. All that gets put into one, and you realize that especially at a time when AIDS was devastating the artistic community, this is a communal statement about what language needs to do, how inventive language needs to be if it's going to respond to this crisis by teaching us how hard it is to resist the temptation to complete everything and to fill everything out. All right, I'm going to ask for one final word on this. Maybe just how it feels to, I mean, avant-garde poets, not known for sentimentality. You do feel sentiment here. What do you feel? Does it make you want to run out and join the forces of avant-garde poets because they're so moving? Dave, your thought on this?
It's funny because when you read an elegy, it's afterwards you're reconstructing the life of somebody, trying to pay homage to them. And here, as a reader, you're basically put into that situation in real time. And the fact that Lee Hickman typeset this, he read it before he passed, I think is pretty interesting because he wrote an elegy to him that he could actually read. That doesn't usually happen.
Yeah, that is unusual. Anybody else want to react to the way this feels? Emily?
Yeah, to return to a line you mentioned earlier, midnight the pain is almost, and there's something deeply sad and amazing at the same time that we all know what comes after that, which is midnight the pain is almost unbearable. And it makes you think, well, why do I know how to finish the sentence? It's because all of us have been in unbearable pain or seen someone been in unbearable pain. And by reflecting on that process, our ability to sort of autofill, autocorrect certain language, we end up mourning ourselves, mourning all the people we've mourned before. It becomes a kind of universal elegy in a way that a closed, more traditional poem probably couldn't.
So the rejection of closure in this instance becomes both personal and, I guess I'm going to use the word universal.